In this video, we're going to talk about not both rules in sequencing games. So these are rules like the one we have before us, where we have either D is before A or D is before E, but not both. We're going to look at how to understand these rules properly, what to do with these rules, and the common logical inferences that we can often make from these rules. So what we have before us here is just a basic sequencing game with 7 variables and 7 positions. Each variable just goes in one of these 7 positions. And our rule here tells us that, as I said, either D is before A or D is before E, but not both. And this can be an intimidating rule for people to use, but we're gonna break it down. So what we do here is the first thing we need to understand is that when we say that either D is before A or D is before E, one of these two options must be true. So just in general, if I say that one of 2 variables, let's use variables that aren't in this logic game, maybe something like either X or Z. If I say that either X or Z is true, then we know at least one of these two has to be the case. That maybe both, but either X or Z, one of the two of them has to be true. And that's the case here, that either D before A or D before E, at least one of these two must be true. The second part of this rule is that but not both. And this is what actually limits the rule to say that not both of them can be true. So either D is before A or D is before E, but we can't have both of these. And that means that once we figure out which one of these two worlds we are in, the world where D is before A or the world where D is before E, we also get to infer something about the relationship to the other variable. So let's see that in action. So let's just say hypothetically that I find out that D is in fact before A. So if that's the case, if D is before A, then now I know that D can't be before E. Because remember, although one of these has to be true, we can never have both. That's what the rule tells us. That we either have one or the other, but not both. So now we don't have D before E. Well, what does that really mean to say that we don't have D before E? Well, this is a one-to-one here sequencing game where we have just 7 variables on 7 positions. Well, D and E both have to go somewhere. It's not like they can go on top of each other. So if we don't have D before E, we must have E before D. That's the negation of D before E, is E goes before D now. Well, so if we have D before A, we also have E before D. Great, well that's a much better way of understanding this half of the rule. So if we have D before A, what that really means is that E is before D is before A. Great, so that's one possible world, right? That the world where we have D before A actually looks like this. So let's look at the other side. What if we have D before E? What if it turns out that D is before E? Well, in that case, we don't have D before A. So we can do the same thing that we did before, and we can say, oh, if we don't have D before A, then we must have A before D. If we have D before E, then we also have A before D. In other words, we have A before D before E. Now remember that one of these two worlds has to be true. Either D is before A or D is before E. Right? One of these two will be true. And we've just translated both these sides into more useful versions, where now we say not D before A, but EDA. Not D before E, but ADE. This is much more useful, and this is what we get to infer because of that not both that's attached to the rule. So notice here in reality what's going on is that D is sandwiched, it's in between E and A. So A and E can change positions, but D will always be in the middle of them. And that's really what we're being told here in this logic game. So the way that we diagram this is we choose one or the other, it doesn't matter which, and we say E before D before A. Let's just choose this one, and we put a switch on top. And this tells us that D is somewhere in between E and A. We just don't know the order of E and A, but we do know that D is somewhere in between them. So that's the first kind of common rule where we see some kind of sequencing with but not both. The second kind of common rule there is something that looks like this. So this rule says either A is before C or C is before B, but not both. And this looks very similar to the rule that we have above, but it's going to play out a little differently. And let's see how. So in order to figure out what our final version of this rule is, we're going to go through the same process that we did before, where we say, okay, so we're going to have one of these. So let's see what each side of this either or looks like. So let's just start with A before C. If we have A before C, then what do we know? Well, we know in this case that C is not before B. We do not have C before B, which of course just means that B is before C. Well, we can just add that on. So if A is before C, then B is before C as well. So that's what we're saying here. Listen, when we have A before C, what we actually have is both A and B, both of them, before C. And that's one option. What's the other? So on the other end, we say, okay, well, we have C is before B. Well, if C is before B, then this side now cannot be true, right? So if we have C before B, then we have to negate the other side. So A is not before C, thus C must be before A. In other words, what we have here is that C can never be sandwiched in between A and B. So either A and B are before C or A and B are after C, but we'll never, ever see C in the middle. And in that regard, this is actually a very kind of the opposite of our sandwich rule up here. This is a never sandwiched rule. C can never be sandwiched in between A and B. And the way we draw this is like this, where we have either A or B is before C slash, or C is before B and A. And we don't really need the but not both here because these are mutually exclusive. We can never have both of these at the same time. That's just logically impossible. So we don't have to worry about the fact that we don't have both. That's just kind of built into the rule. So either A and B are before C, or they're both after C. So how are these rules used in logic games? What are some common inferences that we get to make with these rules? Well, let's imagine that these two rules are actually part of a larger logic game. And our first rule here is that D is sandwiched in between E and A. Our second rule is that C is never sandwiched in between A and B. Let's just say that our third rule is going to be that F is somewhere before G. F is before G. And our fourth rule is going to be that E can never be last. E can never be last. So in this kind of logic game, how would we end up using these rules? What's actually being limited here in our logic game? And as it turns out, what's being limited is both ends of our diagram. And I'm going to talk in a later video about a common inference that's made in sequencing using the ends of our diagrams. But for now, let's focus on the fact that the ends of the diagram are what are being limited here, particularly position 7. But let's just kind of get a feel for this in general. Our first rule says that D must be sandwiched in between E and A. Now, we don't know the order of E and A, but let me tell you one thing we do know is that D can never be on either end of our diagram. D can't be first, D can't be 7th, because we have to have room for E and A on either side of D. So D can if D was here, then where would E or A go? It can't be sandwiched anymore. It's going to end up being before E and A. And the same is true for position 7. So the ends of our diagram here are being limited with D. And the same thing, of course, is true with F before G. F can't go in position 7, and G can't go in position 1. That's just a basic follower and leader inference that we get from sequencing. And this last rule very clearly limits position 7 by saying that E cannot go there. So each of these three rules, the first, third, and fourth, limit the ends of our sequencing diagram. Now you may be thinking, what about this second one? Is the second one doing the same thing, or is this just doing something entirely different? And at first you might be tempted to say, how could this one possibly limit the ends of our sequencing diagram? Any of these variables could go in 1 or 7, and you'd be right. We can put C here in 1 and still fit, A and B afterwards somewhere. We can put C in 7. We can put A and B in 1. Maybe we put A here, B here, and C here, and that works just fine and follows our rules. So at first it seems that there's no limitation here for the ends of our diagram, but there is. The limitation is just context specific, and this is an easy way for the writers of the test to create some good questions, some difficult questions. So notice here, what happens if I put C, which is the variable that's not being sandwiched, in the next to last position, or in the second position? What happens in that situation? So let's say I put C here in 2. Well, now B and A, neither one of them can go in position 1. And why not? Because they can't fit there. And remember, C can't be sandwiched. So we put like A here, well now C is going to be sandwiched. And that's just not allowed according to Rule 2. Same thing happens if we put B here. So A and B now have to go after C, which means they can't go in position 1. And we further limited one of the ends of our sequencing diagram. So let's go ahead over here and say, okay, what if we put C in 6? Same thing happens. We can't put A here now. We can't put B here now, because otherwise C would end up being sandwiched, which is against rule number 2. So this situation here, putting C in 6, this is particularly interesting because of the fact that we have an additional not rule on the end of our sequencing diagram. So let's actually take a look here. If we put C in 6, what happens? Well, E also can't go here in 7, right? Now A and B can't go here because of C in 6. We know that F is never allowed in position 7. D can't go in position 7. So we have A, B, C, E, D, E, and F. Well, who's left over in all this but G? G is now forced into position 7. And we can see how this rule can be used to limit the ends of our sequencing diagram. So what if we went to the other one and put C on 2? Well, this time we don't get to use our not rule. We don't have any rules about specifically about just the first position, but we do know that G can't go here in position 1. And we know that D can't go in position 1. And because C is in position 2, now neither A nor B can go in position 1. And of course C is out, so who are we left over with? We're left in this case with just E or F. And this could also lead to a very difficult logic game question. So whenever I get these rules, where I have either a sandwich rule or I have a not sandwich rule, my first instinct is to say, look at the ends. Look at 1 and 7. How are they being limited in this game? And that's not to say that every single logic game that has one of these rules is going to play on limiting one end of the diagram or the other, but it's more common than you might think. And it's a very easy way for the writers of the test to come up with some inferences that are hard for most people to spot. So I highly recommend that you go through and practice these and pay close attention to how they limit our sequencing diagrams and what kind of inferences are common in these logic games. For more practice with these not both rules in sequencing, the sandwich or never sandwich rules, I recommend you go through my drill book, games 18, 22, 23, 28, and 34. And if you don't have a copy of my logic game drill book, you can find a link in the description. And prep test 52, game number 4, prep test 53, game number 2, prep test 61, game number 2, and prep test 63, games 2 and 3. If you go through these games, you'll get a lot of good practice, and I'm sure you'll get mastery over these rules.